Hello and welcome back to game number 18 of Masters of the Chessboard, where we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and looking at Reti's analysis of these games. So this game is still continuing with the saga of Wilhelm Steinitz, who has the white pieces, and his opponent is Mikhail Chigorin. This is the penultimate Steinitz game, so next game we see will be the last game of Steinitz. Last game of Steinitz in the book. Now here, Steinitz starts off with e4. We have e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, going for the Ruy Lopez again. We see knight f6, and this knight f6 Reti offers a bit of analysis for. He says that this is the Berlin defense to the Ruy Lopez. So instead of trying to defend this e5 pawn, because there's a threat of taking and then taking, not straight away as we've seen, but that's a threat, or this knight can be pinned to the king and we take. So instead of black trying to defend this e5 pawn, instead they played knight f6, counter-attacking the e4 pawn. Now here Reti comments that if white wants an open game, then they should be playing for something like d4. So playing something like d3, if you want an open game, is quite a poor move, as it does nothing to prepare d4. And playing knight c3 to defend this pawn again, it doesn't really do anything to prepare d4, and might make it a bit hard to even play c3 to get d4 in. And likewise, queen e2, potentially defending this pawn, doesn't really do anything to open the game with d4, because d4 loses a defender of the queen, which is the queen will be on e2. Therefore, he comments that if white wants an open game by playing d4, then they're best castling and indirectly defending this pawn. Because if they castle knight takes e4, knight takes e4, we could have something like a rook e1, maybe a common move, and then after perhaps something like knight d6, we could have knight takes e5 then. Or alternatively, and more commonly, you could have d4. So castling can lead to more of an open game. If white wants to get this d4 push in, castling, according to Reti, is the best move. However, Steinitz, as we know, doesn't really like open games as much. He prefers the centre to be a bit closed. So he chooses to play d3. And Chigorin plays d6. And now Reti comments that in positions like this, oftentimes the d3, e4, e5 and d6 pawns are permanent. So they're permanent characteristics of the position. It's very unlikely that these pawns will change, or if they do, it will be later on in the game after a lot of preparation. And therefore, as we've discussed before, white's pawns are all on light squares, meaning that this bishop is a bad bishop. And we see how Steinitz has been able to get this bishop outside of the pawn chain. So, although it's on the same square to the pawns, it's got a bit more activity than black's opposite bishop. And we see how both the kingside bishops in e4, e5 games are often limited, because e5 is in the same colour as the kingside bishop, and e4 is the same colour as the kingside bishop. So in e4, e5 games, it's the kingside bishops that are often a bit more limited, or potentially a bit more powerful. In the instance of this bishop, could be very useful and very powerful. However, with d4 openings and d5, it's often the opposite case. In d4, d5 openings, it's often the queenside bishops that are a bit more limited. So in Queen's Gambit openings, you'll often see white try and get this bishop out to either f4 or g5 before closing the game. And likewise, often this bishop for black in d4, d5 openings will be a little bit more limited. Now in this instance, in this game we see d4, so in this game we see d3, d6 going for the closed position with this bishop outside the pawn chain, and now c3, going for the typical Steinitz setup we've seen time and time again, but also potentially creating a bit of a retreat square for this bishop, because we know how much Steinitz likes the bishop pair. Now we see g6. Now we've seen a fianchetto defense like this before in a previous game. However, it was a lot sooner. It was actually played by Steinitz, but it was a lot sooner. When it was played earlier on in the previous game, White had the option of playing d4 in one move and opening up the game, which would mean that this tempo spent playing g6 would put black at a bit of a disadvantage, because White would be able to get quite a big lead in development and a big initiative. However, here, Reti comments that White has already basically closed the centre. White's clearly not trying to play for opening for like d4, clearly not trying to open up the centre. So g6 is a bit more permissible. Now here we see knight b to d2. Again, going for a similar thing that we saw in game number 16. So in game 16 we saw knight to d2, f1, e3, and to f5, where it exchanged off the dark square bishop, which was here. And we had the same dark square weaknesses around the king. And we see something similar in this game, where this knight goes to f1 and then to e3. And here we see bishop g7, knight f1, castles, and now bishop to a4. Steinitz wants to try and bring his bishop back to c2 if he needs to. He wants to try and keep it safe. He's a bit worried about this knight to d7, knight to c5, which may allow this bishop to be exchanged off after something like a6. So he plays bishop a4 preemptively to try and keep the bishop pair. Then we see knight to d7, knight to e3, and knight to c5, just like we said, trying to exchange off this bishop. But then we see bishop to c2, keeping the bishop, but it's a little less active. It's not nowhere near as good as it was on here, or as good as it would be here. Instead, now it's facing the pawns. Now we see knight to e6, and now h4. And this h-pawn push is very characteristic of Steinitz's games, especially against a fianchetto defense, because the pawn can latch on and a lot sooner. This g-pawn is a bit of a hook for the h-pawn. Now here we see knight plus a pawn. No, we don't see d5. Ah dear. We see knight to e7 in this position, and then h5. And Chigorin counters the attack on the wing with a counter-attack in the centre by pushing d5 now, after preparing it with knight e7, of course. You see h takes g6 and f takes g6. If h takes g6, then Reti comments we might see something like queen to e2, because after this exchange of pawns, there won't be an exchange of queens anymore, because this queen will be on e2. So after h takes g6, we might see something like queen e2, and then after developing this bishop, potentially castling queenside and getting the rooks on this open h-file, which would be quite beneficial for Steinitz here, having this full open h-file towards the king. However, instead, Chigorin takes back with the f-pawn. And here, Reti comments that the weakness in black's position is very different to what would happen if he took back with the h-pawn. In this instance, we see similar weaknesses as to what we've seen in the previous Royal Opus game with Steinitz, where there's potential weaknesses, dark square weaknesses around the king, and there's these open diagonals. Oh dear. Open lines here. And this is what Steinitz sees. These are the open diagonals that Steinitz noticed, and therefore they're going to be the diagonals that Steinitz intends to take. And we've seen this in a few games, especially like a Morphy game, for instance. I remember his opponent pushed the F pawn, and straight away Morphy spent the next 4 or 5 moves controlling all of the potential lines that have been opened to the opponent's king. And we see Steinitz do something similar here. He's going to take control of all these open diagonals. Now, Reti comments that Steinitz had likely found that the previous genius of some of the chess masters, some of the older chess masters, weren't perhaps, some of their brilliant combinations weren't perhaps due to their own genius, as much as it was due to potential weaknesses in their opponent's game. And consequently, Steinitz very likely created what Reti calls a theory of combinations, basically trying to find some form of relationship between different combinations and different plans, and how those combination plans marry up to different weaknesses in the opponent's base, essentially. And due to this, after f takes g6, Steinitz stopped trying to play very defensive, very positionally. He stopped trying to keep this closed centre, and instead set about trying to exploit these weaknesses. And the first step to exploit weaknesses, especially open files, is to open up the centre of the board. And so he takes on d5 first. We see knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and then bishop to b3. The queen moves out the way, and we see how white has conquered one of the exposed diagonals. And next, he's going to have to try and fight for the other exposed diagonal, which is this a1 to h8 dark square diagonal. So we see bishop. No, we don't. We see queen to e2, bishop to d7, bishop to e3, king to h8, moving off this diagonal and freeing the knight. Castles kingside, rook, and now rook a to e8. This rook is x-raying the queen, and it's an attempt to sort of prevent d4. But d4 is still perfectly possible right now. Now here Steinitz plays queen f1, and this move, yes, it sort of helps d4, although d4 was perfectly playable. This move had a bit of a underlying purpose, and we'll see what this purpose is later on. So here Chigorin plays a5. Chigorin wasn't aware of the danger, and so he plays a5 hoping for a counterattack. But it's just a bit too slow. We see d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then rook takes d4. One combination which Reti does give, which I quite like, is if after d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, in the game we saw bishop takes d4, but if we had knight takes d4, then it would lead to a mate in 4 after rook takes h7, king takes h7. This is forced because the bishop controls this square. After queen h1 check, bishop h3 sacrificing it, queen h3 check, bishop h6, and then queen takes h6, we have a mate. So that was the threat of knight takes d4. So bishop takes d4 is the only way to avoid that threat. And now here we see rook takes d4. And at this point Steinitz has now captured the long diagonal. If knight takes, Steinitz could potentially take back with the bishop and have these two bishops eyeing up the king with this semi-open h-file. However, we don't actually see bishop takes d4, although it is still a very good move, and the computer, for instance, gives it at plus 6.6 for white. Steinitz finds mate in 7 with rook takes h7 check. Of king takes h7, queen to h1, And now King G7. I guess the only way to make it a mate in 5 still is to just sacrifice the bishop with bishop h3. But King G7 is a bit more common sense. And then, no, we don't see. So Queen h6 is still mate in 4. But bishop h6 is also mate in 4. We have king to f6. Queen h4 check. King to e5. Queen takes d4 check, and here Chigorin resigned because the only move is king f5, after which queen f4 will be mate. And so there we have it. That's game number 17, another Ruy Lopez by Steinitz. And we see quite a few characteristic things in this game of Steinitz. We see this characteristic pawn setup, the this knight maneuver is quite characteristic of Steinitz's games, but this h-pawn push is also very characteristic of Steinitz. And then, after this weakness is exposed, Steinitz immediately opens up the center to try and utilize these diagonals. Taking control of it first with b3, and then preparing the d4 pawn break to gain control of the final diagonal. You see how all the files towards the opposing king is controlled by Steinitz, just like in Morphy games, really. And so there we have it. That's game number 17. We have one more of Steinitz. And I'll be a bit sad to see the final Steinitz game, actually. I've quite enjoyed Steinitz's games. They're almost quite simple games, but I still really enjoyed them. But anyway, if you enjoyed this game and you're enjoying the series, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you all next time. Thank you for watching.